All right, you fearless Herle Burly-ites. We have a wonderful show that leans to the left today. And before anyone says, David, you're a dreaded socialist, I mean, we're spending the hour talking about the left coast of Canada, the supernatural province of British Columbia. With me are two of the best political thinkers, doers when it comes to that province, Geoff Meggs and Mike McDonald. Geoff is making his first appearance here on the Herle Burly. Until recently, he served as Chief of Staff to former Premier John Horgan. Prior to that, he was a longtime Vancouver City Councillor, on the ballot himself, folks, and Strategic Communications Specialist. Well, anybody can do that. Mike is making his third appearance on the pod. He's been a campaign manager and Chief of Staff to Premier Christy Clark. Currently, he's Partner and Chief Strategy Officer at Kirk&Co, a Senior Research Associate at Pollara, and you can read about what's on Mike's political mind at Rosedeer.blog. Today, we'll be discussing the new EB government. What's it about? How is it performing? Will it hold the Horgan coalition or reshape a new one? What are the issues that might give it trouble, and what will its relations with Trudeau be like? Then, BC United. What's the impact from the name change now and down the road? Is their leader, Kevin Falcon, catching on? What are his strengths and weaknesses? Climate change, housing, reconciliation. We'll touch on it all in the next hour. Geoff and Mike, thank you for making the time to be with me today on the Herle Burly.
Glad to be here.
My pleasure.
Geoff, maybe we can, well, first of all, how's the weather out there? What the hell?
It's just awful. It's
really? What's going on?
Dark. Raining, dark, and more dark, then some more rain. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
That's what causes people who normally would like to live out there to think not living out there. Is it a good reason?
It's an important reason to think about, because I was in Victoria for 5 years with Horgan, and it's much sunnier in Victoria. People laugh when you say that, but it's true. The sun came out for a few hours on Saturday, and the seawall here in Vancouver was clogged with people. A little bit of sunshine, and everybody comes pouring out of their dens and caves and so forth, and tries to get a bit of tan. But yeah. Lovely place to be. Don't want to leave a bad impression, but it's dark and rainy right now.
Mike, you look like a kind of guy that's not troubled by weather. No,
I'm not as gloomy as Geoff. This is BC. Is what we signed up for. Come on.
All right. So let's talk about the new Premier, David Eby. And maybe, Geoff, we could start with you, because you probably know him quite well. What's he like?
Well, he's a very cerebral, committed, focused person. He got his start in activism around the BC Civil Liberties Association, became known as sort of a street lawyer in the downtown east side, and worked on a whole set of issues down there. He will not back down very quickly. He's sharp in his attacks, and I think pretty pragmatic in his proposed solutions, but he will drive hard. And he's a new generation. He's a decade and more younger than, maybe 2 decades younger than John Horgan. So he constitutes a big change in the generational leadership of the BC NDP. And his cabinet shuffle brought a whole bunch of very talented peers like him to the front bench. So he's certainly very focused on the job, and has hit the ground running, as he likes to say, and carried on a hectic pace ever since he got his cabinet sworn in.
He's not a BC native, is he?
No, my understanding is he grew up in Kitchener, Ontario. His dad was a trial lawyer. I think he studied at Dalhousie, but he has been in BC most of his adult life. And
does he get it?
Does he get BC?
Yeah.
Well, I think, as Mike would agree, that's a lifetime project. There are many BCs. That's true of any province, but it's particularly true here, I think. So he understands Vancouver very well. I think he's got a good grasp of the Lower Mainland. Everybody in this job can afford to spend more time in the hinterlands. And so he's certainly doing that. He's going to Prince George today, where I think the demonstration is going to meet him, and he's going to speak to a resources forum. So he's getting out there. But there's a lot of BC, just as there are as any other province, and many, many dimensions to BC that you won't find in other provinces. So I think he does get it, and he's a very hard worker. So he will.
Mike, what's your take on the guy as a person?
Well, I think he's an interesting cat. Like, he's, as Geoff says, I think comes across as cerebral. He's not your typical, person who becomes leader of a party, in that he didn't kind of come up through the party system necessarily. I mean, he's been elected for 9 years, but my impression is that, he's not steeped in the folklore of the NDP, and, wasn't attending BC NDP Riding Association meetings when he was younger, because he wasn't in BC, but also he just came at it from a different angle. And, I think that was evident in the leadership race. when he had great support from caucus, 48 out of 57 MLAs. So clearly he won the support of his colleagues, but didn't really back it up with much of a organizational effort in the leadership race, which just suggests to me that, governing, he's a smart guy. I'm sure he's got his priorities. He's going to do that. But leading a political party takes another set of skills. And I think that's yet to be determined how effective he'll be on the party side of things.
Super interesting point, Geoff. Does he want to be the leader of the NDP or does he want to be the premier?
That's a fair question. I think he obviously wants to be premier and worked hard to that task. He also wants to govern effectively for the whole province. And you've talked about it often on the show, David. There's a wide range of opinion among New Democrats about how committed many are to actually governing. And what Horgan, I think, brought to the table and attracted people like Eby to the cause was a determination to govern. For people, certainly from a left perspective, it was consistent with his values, but to govern and to make tough decisions, which Horgan did. And Eby was there for all of that, and Eby's very capable of making those tough decisions. I think his cabinet selections demonstrated his willingness to fold in some of those different tendencies that Mike's pointing to, putting Katrine Conroy in finance. She's the BC Liberal.
Tell me a little bit about that person. Nobody will. I don't know who that person is.
No, I know. So I was about to say I was muddling my names because Mike's party no longer exists. It's a different name now. So anyway, the UCP has a strong. That's our opposition party, led by Kevin Falcon.
Not the UCP. Yeah.
I'm going to struggle with that.
That's Alberta.
Thing, but anyway,
that's Alberta. That one's not going so well.
BCU.
Yeah.
Well, that's another whole question we'll have to delve into, David. But she is from the Kootenays. She's from a resource community. She's very familiar with forestry issues, which was her previous portfolio, mining and that kind of thing. So a woman in that portfolio who has that rural background and a long, long history in the party was an important signal, I think, to that whole side of the room that they have a voice right at the top of the table. And meanwhile, on the Attorney General side, which is also at the top of the table, Nikki Sharma, a very capable lawyer coming out of Van East, which is one of the most hardcore NDP ridings anywhere. It's Mount Pleasant, it's called. I think I get them all mixed up too. They're very side by side, but East Vancouver, very committed, young, talented lawyer. She'll be around for a long time. So he's done that diversity in his cabinet, and I think he's prepared to do both. He understands he has to.
Well, he expanded the size of cabinet quite considerably to 28, which I think is about the same size that Gordon Campbell had when he got elected with 77 MLAs in 2001. I think there's an interesting challenge facing the Eby government in terms of they've got 2/3 of the MLAs in the legislature, and obviously you get attached to your caucus and you want them to get reelected, but it's stretching their coalition wider. And so in that cabinet change, he brought in 3 MLAs from the Fraser Valley, Abbotsford, Chilliwack, Mission areas, and that's an area where NDP MLAs are you're not supposed to be elected out there. So you're not allowed to, NDPers aren't allowed to be elected in the Fraser Valley, but they are. And so I see in that cabinet makeup that, okay, we're trying to put some roots down in areas that we have not traditionally had people elected in. And as you the voters are different out there. So as you try to consolidate your gains, are you going to give up anything in your traditional base area, right? And there's a tension there. And is this an illusion that,
you're suggesting they should be retreating back to a more defensible coalition?
I just remember from the Campbell experience in 2005 when we went from 77 to 46 in the next election, is that I think we spread our resources a little too thin, and we're not as focused on the real battleground because there was a reflex of the voters to, get back to some equilibrium. And a lot of MLAs we liked were lost because they were in places like Cowichan Valley and Prince Rupert. Right. And so this is a question for the Eby government. It's like, okay, if you're going to try, admirably try to govern for everybody that you have, at some point issues will get sharper and they're going to put pressure on the coalition they're trying to build.
Are there some obvious differences between the Eby government and the Horgan one that preceded it?
It's too. I would say that Eby's been careful to try to maintain the continuity because of Horgan's huge popularity, and but what he's also tried to do is indicate he's a new wave. He's got new legs. He's ready to charge at problems. So he's made a series of announcements about affordability and housing and so forth, which are his key priorities. But I think he's alive to the reality too that when John Horgan left, which was driven as much by health considerations as anything else, he was extremely popular, way more popular than the party had ever been. He was more popular than the party and probably more popular than a previous NDP leader. So David's got a big hill to climb there, but the first polling suggests he's doing fine in that regard. And that speaks to the difficulties that Kevin Falcon's having finding his feet, in my view, in spite of his vast experience.
Well, I think Horgan had some old man strength, which is old guys who usually vote BC Liberal like Horgan. And that kind of shook up the political equation a bit because BC Liberals couldn't get any traction in their own base voters. So with Eby coming in and being a different generation, it's possible that the things could be reconstituted where he reinforces the NDP strength with younger people and BC Liberals reclaim some of their traditional ground on the older voters. But at this point,
is it just an age thing, Mike? Or I mean, just from a very long distance, it looked to me like Horgan more comfortable in a sawmill than Eby.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah. I think that's a perception. But right now, I think Eby's coming into the job with now that he finally got into office. He's got some energy. He's going through that. You've seen it a million times. That first 100 days where you got tons of announcements and you're driving the agenda. Glenn Clark did it to perfection when he became premier in 1996. New governments do this. Campbell had the 90-day agenda. Christy started off, with a great storm of announcements when she became premier. But then suddenly the announcements run out, and there's not as many sexy announceables, and you start governing regularly, and then things start to suck. So when he gets to normal, we'll see how they operate as a government.
Right. David, you put a question in the note you sent before the show, which was, why would anybody care about BC who doesn't live in BC? And, what are the national implications of the politics here? And I think part of the question that's interesting to explore, I don't know the answer, is, well, what is happening to conservatives in BC? What is happening to federal liberals in BC? I mean, even though federal liberals, and Mike can speak to this, and you can, used to say, no, the BC liberals are not liberals. They're not liberals. You got all that wrong. It was a combination of conservatives and liberals federally who worked together for the purpose of creating a successful project here. The new leader of the formerly BC Liberals has changed the name to, I can't remember what, BC United, I think. He is a conservative. The conservative side of that conversation is utterly dominant in a way that it wasn't before. The federal liberal face that was usually on that side of the room to provide a better urban look is not there. And the second national question is, remember the Green Party? Whatever happened to them? I mean, this is the heartland of the Green Party. Now Elizabeth May, who comes from here, is in some kind of bizarre dual leadership relationship. They lost seats provincially in the last election. So I think that although we're not considered a key political market, and that's a problem in central Canada, we are a bit of an incubator or potentially a bellwether of what may be starting to happen or not happen federally with some of these parties, because we're seeing changes here. And Horgan helped drive some of that with the CASA changes, the CASA being the agreement we made with the Greens to have a minority government. Now there's an NDP majority, and as Mike says, the largest in history. And parts of it may not be tenable long term, but that's the question that has to be worked out by Eby in the next couple of years.
Time for a story about resilience, Herle Burly-ites, and reliability. It's about a guy named Tony Hendricks. He heads up a cable assurance team in BC for our presenting sponsor, TELUS. So let me set the scene. November 2021. Atmospheric rivers are flooding the interior of the province. Now, I know atmospheric rivers is a descriptive term, but I'm not sure it does justice to what was actually happening on the ground. A water world level catastrophe. In many areas, there was no ground, at least none visible, Water raging everywhere, destroying homes and highways, vital fiber and cable connectivity severed over hundreds of kilometers. Tony and his team's job was to restore that connectivity as quickly as possible along Highway 8 near Spence's Bridge. While surveying the damage in a helicopter, he got an emergency radio call that the RCMP search and rescue team needed help. On the last high strip of road, down in a canyon that had just managed to stay above water, he saw Kim Cardinal, her husband Lorne Thibodeau, 2 horses, a mule, plus their cats and a litter of tiny Caucasian shepherd puppies, only weeks old, stranded while attempting to hike out of the area. Their farm swallowed up by the floodwaters. Kim was helicoptered out later that night, but Tony's job was to keep Lorne and the animals safe, delivering food, water, and generator fuel over the next few days until they were safely airlifted out by the RCMP and SPCA. Connectivity was triaged and back online in a matter of days. And over the next 11 months, Tony and his team would go on to update and replace over 60 kilometers of damaged infrastructure to help protect the area in the event of another natural disaster. Postscript. As a reward for his efforts in those harrowing days, Tony came away with one of those puppies. He named him Canyon. There's a human side to the resilience and reliability story at TELUS, and there's a multi-billion-dollar operations side. Both are about people connecting with other people. We'll be telling those stories over the coming weeks, Herle Burly-ites. Stay tuned. Well, so, Mike, take that issue on. Man, again, I'm going to rely on my age and go back to when I was first involved in the Liberal Party, and there was no thing that mattered called the BC Liberal Party. It ran candidates but didn't elect people, tried to elect its leader. It was that kind of party, right? And the province was governed by the social credit. Now, the people, federal Liberals who were involved in BC politics were involved in the social credit. There were a number of prominent federal Liberals that were involved in social credit, but nobody thought that was remotely a Liberal party or had a Liberal policy agenda to it. Then along came the BC Liberal Party as this replaced the Socreds as the coalition, as the anti-NDP coalition, but it felt way more Liberal to me. It was led by Liberals. Christy Clark, lifelong Liberal. Certainly Gordon Campbell seemed like a Liberal. And it did things that surprised you if it was a Conservative party. Is that all over now?
No, I don't think it is. Yes, Falcon's background is as a Conservative, but I think the BC Liberals / United Party behave very differently than the federal Conservatives. You will not see Polyev style rallies happening provincially because I think Falcon's team understand. I think if anything, they're going to try and take a page out of the ABC, which won the mayoralty in Vancouver and charted a very centrist course. And I think that there's a formula there that they're probably interested in. Polyev, is very successful at raising money in British Columbia. He's very successful in getting 1,000 people in Nanaimo out to a hall or people, anywhere in this province. But, that won't work. In my opinion, that does not work provincially in terms of governing, having a coalition that can govern, because they'll hit a hard ceiling. And so Falcon's got to chart to the center. And, I do think there is a bit of Nixon goes to China thing here where Falcon can take on some positions in the center that might have been tough for a Liberal to take on, but Conservatives may trust him, even if he's doing things that are non-conservative. So it's a work in progress for them.
Isn't the risk more on the other side, though, that the NDP will capture Liberals who no longer see themselves in this party?
Well, that's my point, is that I think Falcon's team understands they have to win back. The Liberals, the horse left the barn a while ago. The Liberals are draining out of the party going back to the 2017 election. And
what do you mean by that?
Well, it's just the party was losing its grip in urban seats, and we were doing okay in the interior, very strong in the interior, but that's a diminishing pool of seats. But holding its own in the suburbs, but starting to lose in the urban. And then, in the last election when Horgan had the big win, he just ran the table in the suburbs. And so now, the United Party, Liberal Party is basically an interior dominated party, which is a big problem. So as Geoff was saying earlier, they've got to get back into the urban areas and have a new face for the party. Because when the Free Enterprise Coalition, if we call it that, when it has been successful, usually it's a big bang event where W.A.C. Bennett came in with no baggage at all, 52, governed for 20 years because he left all the stuff that voters didn't like about the previous governing coalition behind. He finally got tired. Dave Barrett came in. There was another big bang event where Bennett Jr. came in and brought the Liberals in and had 3 Liberal MLAs cross the floor. And it was Liberals at the heart of government. And they went on for 16 years and it blew up. And then the Liberals came along in a big bang and left all the baggage of the social credit behind. But now you've got Falcon, who's got the baggage of the previous government, and he was part of it. So he has got to create a narrative that's bold and exciting, and they're not there yet.
I would agree, and I think this is the challenge for, you look at how warm is somebody. Do you want to have a beer with them? Everybody would love to have a beer with Horgan. Nobody really wanted to have a beer with Gordon Campbell, who was a very successul premier for what.
Although I saw a picture that looked like it might be fun once.
Yeah. Fair point. Yeah, that humanized him. Right? That humanized him. They were referring to the infamous DUI received by Campbell on a vacation in Hawaii, and the mugshot that emanated from it. But Campbell was able to effectively govern, and he brought that urban sensibility to the fore in a way that I think Kevin Falcon is struggling to do. So if you compare Eby to Falcon, Eby has a strong message. He's active. Of course, he has the advantages of government. But Falcon, I think, is struggling to shed all of his experience, which he likes and is helpful to him in some respects. Stop talking about what he did when, how terrific he was back in that time when a lot of British Columbians weren't around or they have bad memories, and talk about what he would do next. And he's in danger of being yesterday's man, in my view. And also, I'm not as convinced as Mike that he sees the need to move to the center. I would agree. And this is also obscured anybody else in Canada, but Vancouver city politics, at least for now, maybe it'll become Surrey in the future, are kind of the second tier theater for politics in BC. And the sweep just executed by this new party led by a number of conservatives, and there may be some federal liberals in there, but they're not notable, was very much a drive to the center. We haven't seen Falcon do that. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see down the road how he tries to navigate through all of those shoals.
Well, you're a loser until you're a winner. And opposition leaders often look like losers. And John Horgan looked like a loser in 2015 and was pretty down on the mouth. When Christy was riding high, yet 2 years later he's premier. So, I think if I was the Falcon team, they've got a lot of work to do, but I wouldn't think it's impossible. I mean, politics can change on a dime, and no one's talking about having a beer with David Eby either. He's not Horgan.
That's my point. Yeah.
So there's a lot of games to be played yet.
So can I just to get right into the weeds, Mike? Are there liberals around Falcon?
Yeah. I mean,
well, I don't know how convincing that answer was.
Well, I mean, I'm not super wired into the team being yesterday's man.
Well, that says something in and of itself.
Well, no, that's my own choice. But no, I think they recognized the need. They reach out. I know they reach out. He's got lots of liberals on Rolodex. They want them involved. There's no doubt about it. As I was saying earlier, this is not it's a two-front war, as it is with the NDP. They got to go to the center, and they've got to try and bring the liberals in, but they got to keep the BC Conservative Party at bay. Just as the NDP, want to go to the center and suck up all those federal liberals. At the same time, they've got the former leadership candidate who was trying to take them to a place where away from the electoral heart that they need to be at. So both parties have this tension and have to balance those competing interests. But I this idea that Falcon and it's a hard right conservative group around him and doing that stuff, that's not the case, in my opinion.
I'm just jaded by the Saskatchewan Party, which was alleged at the beginning to be a coalition of conservatives and New Democrats and liberals, sorry. Mm-hmm. And I don't think anybody has any doubt that that's a conservative party 15 years later.
Yeah.
But
we got one last point though, David. Like, when we talk about liberals and conservatives, I actually don't like the definition of it as a coalition of liberals and conservatives, because most voters are neither. They're just voters. And especially out in the burbs,
but who's involved affects the party and what it stands for and what it represents, right?
Fair enough, but keep your eye on the ball, which is what do the people want, right? Like, and they don't give a shit about the labels as much.
Okay, all right. So there's nothing Canadians like better than talking about weather. So let's do a little review, shall we, of the winter so far. It started early. A big, ugly storm arrived in the western provinces at the end of November. The usual, heavy winds, lots of snow, and of course good old Arctic air. A week or so later, temperatures dropped to minus 31 Celsius between Cape Real, Ontario, and Edmonton. In mid-December, another blizzard slammed the prairies. Snow, blowing snow, poor visibility, highway closures, and then another big Arctic air bully. It got really, really cold and stayed that way until Christmas. We've all read about the massive snow dumps in southern BC, where massive snow dumps aren't supposed to happen. First it was 15 centimeters of snow, then extreme cold, then another 20 centimeters of snow. Oh, and then heavy rains. Lovely. And then, of course, there was the great, big, massive, horrible, nasty blizzard and freezing rain and deluge of snow that ruined Christmas in eastern Canada. So, to get to the point, in the middle of all this, our sponsor, CN, moved 2.5 million metric tons of grain and grain products out of the prairies to markets in Canada and abroad. That's the second best December ever for the railroad. It was moving grain at something close to 98% of maximum capacity. Why, you ask? Well, the C in CN stands for Canadian, and CN knows a thing or two about operating in the northern winter. The company has spent billions on technology that helps trains withstand snow and cold and ice and arrive on time. And its relentless focus on ensuring trains depart on time, no excuses, helps too. CN's not trying to brag here, but it does want to reassure. Vital stakeholders like our grain producers, our mining companies, and our forest industry need to know CN's trains will run on time. And they do. Can I ask you two, what are the issues that are animating politics, whether federal or provincial, in BC right now? What are the things that are driving political action?
Well, cost of living first and foremost. When Eby was sworn in, he made an announcement that was both on a carbon tax measure and a direct energy cost measure that would support home incomes direct straight to people's pockets. And he's re-announced them a couple of times. That's the crucial ball, of course, that everybody in Canada is chasing right now. And he's using everything he can to be responsive on that front with a budget to come. And I would
of course, you can't really make a difference for people. So you're just trying to look like you're making a difference for people, right?
Well, you can make a bit of a difference, but you're right. You can't be quiet. You have to show that you get the issue. I think the second one is housing affordability. And environmental issues are huge in BC, and I think they will be down the road. But the two that people care about when they wake up in the morning is what's my bank balance look like? And is anybody doing anything to make it look better?
Right. The housing thing, how's that manifesting itself politically? Is anybody in politics a villain? Does anybody have an idea that's catching fire?
Well, I think in the last city election here in Vancouver, there was a group that it formed, which I thought maybe would have a little more legs. And that was basically challenging this orthodoxy that's starting to build in government, which is supply. And build higher buildings, build them all over the place, especially near transit lines. And there was a reflexive reaction to that, including a good friend of Geoff's and mine, Bill Thielman, who got involved as a NDPer in this kind of anti-growth political party. But it sputtered during the campaign. So I feel like this supply argument is where EB's going. It's frankly, I don't think the BC United Party has a problem with it either. So I think that's kind of the political answer right now, is just build more housing, chunk it into the system. Is this a question what the mix is going to be and how much money are they going to pour into the...
But a bunch of oxes have to get gored. A bunch of oxes have to get gored to build more housing, right?
Well, I think part of the, I voted on a lot of housing. Now I'm back in Vancouver. I see some of it. None of it was particularly affordable. The problem is that if the private sector could solve the housing cost problem, they would have. And we've built an enormous amount of housing under various administrations, like record numbers. There's even questions about whether there's enough workers to build anymore. So most of the solutions have been fully on, I would say, private sector solutions, saying, well, if you bring on enough supply, the value must necessarily go down. But if you're doing that while 500,000 new Canadians arrive every year, while population continues to grow in various ways, you're not going to catch up. The challenge for all governments, in my view, is to find a way, and I think this is where Ottawa really should be playing a role and has it. I mean, most of the affordable rental housing in the city and across BC was built under the multi-unit residential benefit, or whatever the program was called, back in the 70s, which Canada has adamantly refused to restore, but built an awful lot of cheap rental housing. And without some other federal measures, I don't know where we're going to go. The supply mantra, as Mike says, causes heartburn in places where, in this city, where they already can have a laneway house, they can already have a secondary suite. They're not really that keen on having a 16-story building right behind them, and the enemy that many people have pointed to is municipal city councils. And politically, while many of them are very difficult and intractable people, they are elected too. And I think there's a price down the road to being too tough on the municipal councils. So no enemy has been found, David, to answer your story. But the savior will not be, you can't do it without supply. It's a necessary condition for success. I don't think it's the only condition you need. I think you need some different.
But that's where EB has signaled that he wants to have that,
that's
or at least a discussion with municipal governments, where he's complaining that they're not bringing the permits fast enough to enable this housing. So that'll be an interesting political discussion.
Well, I'm going to ask you to comment on something uncomfortable, and just something that I don't know, but I speculate on from a distance, having done a little bit of public opinion research in BC over my life. What are the racial undertones to this housing issue?
Well, there was one overtly for some time. It's been muted now, that Chinese foreign investment, and the emphasis was always Chinese foreign investment, was the problem. And I was in a number of interesting conversations with the Chinese consul general, who said, foreign investment is a problem. We don't allow it in China. We don't know why you do it here, but why do you always say it's us? So there has been a racial undertone. I think it's receded. That's my judgment. I don't have any numbers to point to. I think that the current, the other charged issue is the decision of the federal government to continue to ramp up refugee arrivals and, every possible entry point for immigration. I'm a big supporter of a strong immigration policy and a positive immigration policy. I think it's needed, but I don't think there's a plan. I think there's just a decision to keep opening the gates. And I know in the immigrant settlement community, there's anxiety about what that will produce in terms of a political backlash at some point. A lot of people are coming here as international students or whatever, and there is no plan to manage their housing on top of the issues faced by long resident British Columbians.
Mike, you guys thought about that?
Yeah, on the racial undertone thing, I don't think it's the dominant theme in a way that's been in the past. But I will say that he got into trouble when he was minister, where he was extrapolating the money laundering issue to the housing market and was using a methodology that tied back to the Chinese community, and was kind of rebuked for that. And so, it's dangerous ground politically when you get into those conversations. But I would say the more common theme I hear about is generational, and it's younger people burnt out by older people, baby boomers, having all this housing capital, so to speak, and they can't get into the market. So I think if there's a blame game at all going on, it's more like, I can't get in, but look at all these guys in single family homes and sitting on the real estate, that kind of thing. it's not necessarily unreasonable for somebody to have a home that they've lived in for 30 years and just happens to go up in value. But that's where I think there's envy there among younger people who can't get in.
For sure. I'm curious about safe injection sites, because it's not really an issue here in Toronto that I hear about, but I hear about it with reference to Vancouver a lot, and Pierre Poilievre talks about it. And so I hear about it that way. Is that an issue in BC politics?
No, the overdose deaths are an issue. I would say BC has got a broad consensus that harm reduction, not what Pollara is criticizing, because I think he's wrong on a number of key facts, but that harm reduction is critical. And we are on a very, very difficult course here where we're trying to manage down the impact of an addiction crisis, which has its roots deep in all kinds of factors. We have also agreed here uniquely among the provinces to, starting at the end of this month, to decriminalize the possession of small amounts of hard drugs, which has been controversial and was really a tough issue from the standpoint of the federal government. They tried and tried and tried in Ottawa to find a way to have it just in Vancouver, or somehow narrow the scope of it. But I think generally speaking, British Columbians are so worried about the overdose crisis that they are fine with prescribed drug treatments. They're fine with supervised injection sites and safe consumption sites. They would there's nobody who hasn't now known someone who knows someone who lost a close family member, whatever, to the overdose crisis.
It is so surprising to me. I mean, you talk about this issue entirely from the perspective of the victims of overdose or of fentanyl, whatever is out there that's damaging people. But I find it stunning if it is the case that people are more concerned about those addicts than they are about crime and safety in the Lower East Side.
I'm not sure that that's true, though. I agree with your caution on that. I think there's a danger in the entire debate that the focus is entirely on, as there needs to be a focus for treatment and support for people who are facing addiction. But there has been a controversy, and it was certainly it's been alive in the legislature, it's been alive in the recent mayoral thing, and certainly Kevin Falk and his team have been pointing to it, not so much on the straight drug side, but on the so-called catch or release policies of David Eby, which are actually federal policies. There's a strong concern about this, as there should be. And I think there is a political risk in turning your back on the crime aspect, or appearing to do so and focus exclusively on the harm reduction.
Yeah, I mean, I think fentanyl's been brutal, and it's made life a lot harder on the streets, for sure. And not just on the streets, like it's not just downtown East Side. It's everywhere, right? It's in construction sites and you name it. Every community in this province. Just reading a story this morning that Dawson Creek's got a huge problem, right? And it's not just Dawson Creek, it's Nanaimo, it's all these places. But in the research I've done, public opinion research, David, is that what I see, I think the public's got a nuanced view. I think the public realizes that they want action on revolving door. They want Crown Counsel and judges to step up, and guys who've been arrested 100 times not to spit back out on the street. But also they realize that there needs to be more mental health support. There needs to be more treatment. And that just basically the overall effort of government is not enough. And they're seeing it through crime. They're seeing it through opioid deaths, you name it. And I think there's a drive among the public that they think like we need to reinstitutionalize, like Riverview, the big hospital, mental health hospital in BC was basically, emptied, in the 80s and 90s. And, you hear a lot about that, just saying, some people need to be in a secure facility. It's not safe to them or to others. So those are the types of debates we're going to have. And I think Eby's signaled an openness to reinstitutionalization as well. It's going to be a tough discussion, but I think everything's on the table.
So just to flip quickly to federal politics for a second. So if what voters hear from Trudeau on this issue is all carrot and no stick, and if they hear from Poilievre all stick and no carrot, who ultimately comes out the winner in that?
Trudeau.
I'm not sure, Mike. I think that although the criticisms raised by Pollara are dubious, and they've been debunked by various people and so on, the the reality is that there isn't an agreed form of treatment. It's not a medical condition where you can say, okay, you broke your arm, you put on a cast, you're going to be okay. There isn't anything like that in this. And that causes a lot of concern and confusion. And there's a lot of debate in the treatment community too. So average Canadians run into all kinds of different responses to this about who could be, am I clean and sober? Did I hit bottom? Am I now finally prepared for treatment, and so on? And so there's a willingness in some quarters still to blame people who face addiction. On the other hand, I think the public opinion here shows that although the advocates for harm reduction are now saying, well, we can't get doctors to prescribe, so we should just let nurses prescribe, is way beyond the public's tolerance level. They want a medical professional, someone pretty senior, saying to me, if I have a drug abuse problem, what are you going to do on the other side if I give you this, if I give you methadone, if I give you something else? And there's where I think there's a risk for the Prime Minister, in the sense that he may appear to be without boundaries on this score, whereas Pollara will be saying, of course I care, I want more treatment, I want this or that. I think it's a risky area. It's not dominant or that salient. And here in BC, we were in a very different place for all kinds of reasons. The other issue, though, federally, that I think is key, David, I don't know if you're going to go there, but it's a bit in the paper this morning, is national energy policy and how Canada decides to deal with some of the big conflicts that have been going on the energy side, because we mostly see it discussed in terms of the oil sands, but natural gas is the next big thing, as Mike's boss, Christy Clark, made clear, and as Horgan wound up implementing in terms of one big project, the largest private sector investment in Canadian history, but very contested ground politically and hits right at people's homes.
I heard there's no business case for LNG. That's what I heard from the Prime Minister.
I didn't. I missed that.
There's lots of people looking to invest lots of money in it.
He gets slammed for having said that at some point, I guess, maybe to the Germans when they were here, or around the time when the Germans were here. But that was, listen, I've lost track of that issue. So bring me up to speed. Last I knew, Christy Clark said that LNG was going to transform the economy of British Columbia and fix our climate change problem for us. And then, did anything ever get built?
It's being built right now. It's the largest project in Canadian history, and I do some work on the pipeline issue, and it's 84% complete. Just getting through kind of on the final stretches. It's not easy. There's lots of geography involved, and there's lots of Indigenous issues involved. But when LNG Canada opens, it will be a significant revenue generator and economic benefit to Canada, and it will displace coal-fired emissions in Asia. So, and that's just phase one. And then the question is there going to be more? Is LNG Canada going to expand? The Nishka have a significant proposal, Sialism's project, and that's on the table. The Haisla have their own smaller floating LNG project, which is before environmental assessment determination right now. These are the new projects are Indigenous led, with obviously substantial financial backing behind it. The pipeline has Indigenous equity in it. So since this all happened in the last 10 years, when I was chief of staff, I didn't even know what LNG was when I first got in the office. And then, 2 years later, we're all in on it. It does have substantial economic advantages. It has substantial environmental advantages if you think about it in terms of displacing dirtier forms of power in Asia. But that's a crossroads the EB government has to come up to here and decide, can they reconcile LNG expansion with their climate plan? And that is the issue, because if you look at it on a global basis, if you look at it in terms of Canada's broad interests in terms of energy security in the world and your allies and what it will do to emissions overall, there's a really strong case for it. But if you look at it very narrowly in terms of what BC's emissions are going to be, then it's going to be very challenging to meet those targets.
Yeah, you see, phase one, David, was incorporated in the new plan that the NDP brought in after Horgan came into power. So he had supported LNG within a plan. So the plan incorporated the phase one emissions. Now phase two is coming. The proponents are loving this. They're saying, wow, we made a good decision. When everybody else thought LNG was dead as a dodo, we said, no, it's just resting. We made an investment. Now we look like geniuses. So the prime minister's just received a strong delegation from Germany saying, hey, given the Russian situation, we would love some gas. That's, of course, on the wrong side of the continent. Japan just arrived and made the same plea, which is probably a difficult plea for a Japanese prime minister to make, to say to somebody like the head of a smaller country, could you please get that gas going? They just want to go straight to phase two. And your sponsor, CN, will remember that, in my view and in my life, this was far bigger deal than the Freedom Convoy, was the national protest that shut down CN for days and days to protest the development of this pipeline. And, from a sort of a political and policy standpoint, these environmental issues are critical and very, very difficult. Provincially, as Mike says, there's no doubt about it. It's a very tough one. The BC public loves to have a plan. They want to see it real. They're not quite sure how it works. And they would like to see economic development in the north. It's equally tough for the federal government. But this is where, in the great scheme of things, I would say BC is not their main concern. And so it's been really unclear how the Trudeau government, which wants to be green as possible, will manage this issue going forward.
I immediately think of a regional issue. Like, how can the Trudeau government be boosting gas development in BC while against oil development in Alberta?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, they do own an oil pipeline, but
right.
But right. I think there's so many reasons why.
They're bringing in a just transition away from oil in Alberta. What would the argument be in British Columbia? Well,
on an interprovincial basis too, even though I'm sure the Prime Minister and the Premier of Alberta aren't exchanging postcards very regularly, enabling the export of LNG is great for BC, but it's also great for Alberta too. And it's good for national unity. It's good for all the reasons that I mentioned earlier too. But they have to square it with these climate commitments and what's the story? How are you going to rationalize that? And that's where the real political work begins. And I think for EB here, bring it back to BC for a second, this issue is divisive within the NDP voter base. United Party, all in, no problem. But it's right down the middle. I wouldn't say it's right down the middle. The research I've done, a plurality, a larger group of NDP supporters support LNG than oppose it. So it's just a hard left, really green part of the NDP that's going to be a problem. The leadership candidate who challenged EB represents that, and so he needs a good story.
These are calculations that I think they have to make in Ottawa, because this is where I wonder, after the time I spent there, and Mike had a different experience, but maybe not that different, is when it comes right down to it, is BC a consideration in national politics? It never felt like it to me. And Horgan and Trudeau had a notoriously good relationship for most of the time.
Right. I thought they were great buds, Horgan and Trudeau. And cooperated well together. I couldn't believe when Horgan did that deal on childcare right on the eve of the federal election. I thought just taking the legs right out from under Singh. So wasn't BC an important factor to the Trudeau government? Horgan didn't have insight?
Well, he yes and no, and I think that's the question mark. And calculation was hard to make. I guess on this gas issue, for example, what's public domain is that 4 years ago, there was an agreement that there should be electrification of the gas fields to reduce emissions, just for good policy reasons, never mind to support expansion, although critics would say it was strictly to support expansion. Canada agreed that there should be a lot of work done on that, but none was ever done. Same on the health file, which we see Doug Ford wading into now. It always seemed to Horgan, and he said so publicly, that it was a good idea to make an agreement between like-minded leadership at the Premier's table, like him and Trudeau, but it didn't happen. I think that would have been good federally too. And so, when you look at BC and its national consequences, the energy piece is like a critical thing nationally. it's not clear to me that Ottawa has any idea what to do about it. Even down to investments, and this is where it gets back to people. Like it feels to me like all of it's done on laptops or larger computers by people in offices in Ottawa or Victoria. They don't think about how is it going to be for me, to change my life, for example, to an electric vehicle, or if I'm a trucker, how do I get one of those hydrogen trucks, and could I ever afford it? Or if I'm working as an Amazon driver, same thing. There's nothing specific happening on the climate side right now, except these huge policy things, which are very, very big to me. And so if the Prime Minister wants to beat his rap for being too woke and too green or too whatever, he needs to find something in that space. And I agree with Mike. It's a risk for EB, because even if EB feels very clearly and strongly about LNG, Kevin Falcon's team has never had any doubts in their minds about it, and can make a credible case they can get it done. And if that's what the public would prefer, then that's a strong card for them to play. The Ottawa needs, for its own reasons, in my view, to work with BC, because the climate issue is critical. We need to make that plan work. But
is Jonathan Wilkinson seen as a strong advocate for BC, Mike?
Well, I was going to say that I think Jonathan Wilkinson is probably the best asset the federal Liberals have in BC. He's at the center of these discussions. I think he's the Minister of Natural Resources right now. Yeah. But he was Environment. He has some industry experience from before. But he strikes me as a very active minister. I'm told he's very influential in Ottawa in terms of being a voice around the cabinet table.
He won some big fights by the looks of it.
But he doesn't have a huge presence in BC, you and I come from the old school of there are regional ministers, right? Mm-hmm. Regional ministers who control their domain, and I don't feel like that's the case here. Like I think it is a pretty centralized federal government, and I think Wilkinson's a strong player in it. But I would like to see him be seen to be more active out there. How's BC fit in Canada, and how do we take these energy issues and put them all together? And I'm the guy at the center of it. Now,
it's a big mistake not to have regional ministers.
Yeah, I think he is at the center of things. It's just that you don't hear about it that much. Right. And but he's very well situated right now to navigate all these issues we're talking about and try to land them. So I'm interested to see. I think he's actually off in Japan right now on some form of trade mission to do that. And Mr. Champagne has also been seen as an advocate, on the export side and as it relates to energy too. So I mean, there are some people in cabinet that are aligned on these things, but it's they got to pick a lane here.
He would have no profile in BC though. He's got barely any profile in Quebec.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's talking inside baseball.
Yeah, for sure. Hey, while we're on climate and energy, I was listening to an interview with Pierre Poilievre the other day, and if he's consistent on anything, it is that he's going to cancel the carbon tax if he gets elected. He's going to kill the carbon tax in Canada. BC was the home of carbon tax in Canada. How does that policy of his go over in BC? His argument is, I don't need a carbon tax to fight climate change. I'm in favor of fighting climate change. We got to fight it with more hydroelectric energy, more nuclear energy. We got to keep the prices down. And I'm going to cancel the carbon tax.
It's a good question. I think, as Geoff said earlier, cost of living is kind of top of the polls right now. And a lot of people just want relief. And is carbon tax on its own making a difference? It makes some of a difference, but it's not a panacea on climate change in any event. So, to me, it comes down to, will this help them in the suburbs? Or is it a signal to urbanized voters, many of who live in the suburbs too, that this guy's a Neanderthal? So what's the upside versus the downside? You drive away people who have a more, who care about climate change, who are moderate voters that might be open to voting for him. Probably not a lot of them. Versus throw some red meat at people concerned about cost of living.
Yeah, I would say many, many years ago, the NDP took an anti-carbon tax position when Gordon Campbell brought it in and decided that was a big mistake after he won the next election. And it's now a common position across all the parties. I mean, Kevin Falcon can't campaign against the carbon tax, but the impact of carbon tax increases is real for people. And it's one of those cases where, there's good policy and then there's good politics. And we've seen our gas prices go up and down like it's dizzying rises and drops. Not driven by carbon tax, but carbon tax and something we have here called the low carbon fuel standard, which is forcing lower carbon content in existing gas supply, will drive a big increase in gas prices over the next number of years. But so many other factors are driving gas prices, which no one can explain, that I think it's harder to say it's just that. And I think if Polyev goes down that road, it'll prove that he's a climate change denier. That's the risk for him. The only thing that we have that's really producing measurable reductions is things like the tax measures. And that's why I cry the blues to any environmentalists I meet about the lack of substantive new technologies, whether it's hydrogen or whatever, that would give me some confidence that the sacrifices I'm making on my barbecue by turning off the gas or whatever are going to be met by some savings somewhere else. And I think that's a huge problem for the whole climate debate.
But if Trudeau is going to say that you have to have a carbon tax to have a credible climate plan, does that not mean Joe Biden doesn't have a credible climate plan? I thought the whole world was saying, hey, Joe Biden's doing great things on climate.
Yeah.
Well, I think the budget will be difficult for the government because they obviously are very concerned about the competitive pressures put on us by the Biden investments, which are all in the economic stimulus side, technology investment, and so forth. I haven't read them closely, but that's what I think is missing here. And if we had more of it, it would be easier. It would be easier to sell a carbon tax. If you're saying to me, well, okay, yeah, I know you're fed up with the carbon tax, it's costing a lot of money, but we're doing this over here, so soon you won't need to worry about gas at all. But we don't have that conversation. It's really very much a finger-wagging exercise at most Canadians saying, you know what, you're consuming too much and you're just going to have to stop. We're going to tax you till you quit. And that's where Polyev, I think, can make some headway.
Cool. All right, listen, you two British Columbians, you are so used to being victims of Confederation. You're so used to complaining about how you turn on the television and the federal government's been decided already, and BC votes don't matter, and blah, blah, blah. Well, that's not true anymore. You're a battleground that decides the federal government. Have you mentally made that leap that British Columbia is one of the few actual battlegrounds in the country where the government gets decided?
I think I agree with you that the Lower Mainland in particular has become quite a battleground, and Justin Trudeau has done a good job of growing the party's footprint. And for the Liberals to own Surrey is a significant achievement, and they had never won a seat in Surrey prior to Justin Trudeau coming along. So yes, do we care? No. We are indifferent.
I would say it makes us, or me at least, more demanding and entitled and honked off when I don't see stuff coming. Like when I watched the last Ontario election and I see Trudeau standing next to Ford with barrels and barrels of cash for this, that, and the other thing on the environmental front, I go, well, what are we, chopped liver? I mean, that was not a warm friendship.
That's what you thought. What do you think Stephen Del Duca thought?
We're not. BC's not. Doesn't play the regional card like Alberta does or Quebec does. That doesn't. I mean, that might have been the case several decades ago when BC was kind of lumped in with the West in terms of grievances, but it's we haven't figured that out, how to leverage that.
Well, I guess it is the case, I think, though, that Trudeau can't win a government. Can't win a government without holding on to his seats in BC. And is that going to be the case? There's some talk in the rest of Canada about Trudeau fatigue. It's been 7 years now. It will be 10 years by the time of the next election. But since BC pays no attention to federal politics, do you still have the same level of Trudeau fatigue out there that people in Ontario might have?
I think there's Trudeau fatigue, but I also think Poilievre's already has pretty high negatives. And I think it's going to be an epic battle when it gets to that. And say for the 100th time, it's going to be out in the suburbs where that fight will be. But at this point, I do not underestimate Trudeau's brand here in BC, because he does have a connection here to BC that is pretty strong. And even though a lot of people are burned with him, I can't remember what the popular vote numbers were in BC last time. It was like 28% or something like that. But it was enough, right? And it was highly efficient, and it was in all the right places. So like in the Lower Mainland specifically, Trudeau is strong in ethnic communities and in the urbanized areas. So it will be tough for the Conservatives to chip off many seats there. In fact, the Conservative seats that are probably more likely for them to pick up are NDP seats on Vancouver Island than Liberal seats in the Lower Mainland.
Yeah, I think I would agree with most of what Mike said, and I think part of the challenge for my party, for the federal NDP, is to figure out, given that it has the largest chunk of its seats total come from BC. I think I'm certain that's the case. There's some very capable MPs there who probably will continue to win just based on their personal performance. And I think of Taylor Backrack, who's just been in the news the last couple of days over various things, Don Davies, they're all great. But the federal presence and Jagmeet Singh's presence hasn't registered in the way that you would want it to if you were going to continue to hold those seats. And I think...
Well, why not? He's a member from there, for God's sake.
Well, he came out here and ran for a whole set of reasons. But I think this is something you guys have commented on quite a bit on the program, and it's a challenge for him. And I'd like him to have a lot of respect for him. But I think there's a lot of work that the NDP needs to do federally to figure out a bunch of these problems. It currently has not got that perspective. So everybody bursts out laughing when Jagmeet says, when I'm prime minister, okay, and I get why everybody bursts out laughing. However, at least he's saying it, and that's where Leighton changed the channel quite a bit. He said, I'm in this to be prime minister. It's not a hobby. I want to be prime minister, and put out a feasible path that turned out to at least become opposition leader, and who knew what would have happened otherwise. So there was a series of close elections, close together in time, which gave Leighton an opportunity to move the pieces down the field more often. Jagmeet's had that too, but I think what he's still missing and makes him vulnerable is that he's not been able to communicate that sort of perspective, which has been complicated by his deal with the federal Liberals. And you can see this happening in Alberta, where they go, okay, it's Trudeau, Singh, Notley. We don't have that issue here, but as Mike points out, the candidate who popped up out of nowhere to run against Eby had been a federal candidate, spent the first week and a half of the federal campaign complaining about old growth strategy, which was not a federal issue. So Jagmeet's got a challenge in terms of setting that table for Canadians, what an NDP government would look like.
Well, what's he about? Do you know him, Geoff? Like, I don't know what the guy's about.
Well, I know his biography. I've met him on a number of occasions, but I wouldn't argue that I know him. But I think it's well known. He came as a lawyer. He was one of the few political autobiographies that I picked up thinking, oh God, I guess I have to read this. That I actually deeply enjoyed and thought was very authentic and gave me an insight into someone who had dealt with his father's alcoholism, had helped his family through tough spots, had done a lot of good things, which you don't hear about too much in his political communications. Not that you can keep talking about it indefinitely, but it doesn't. That's that gritty side of him I haven't seen. And I think the other part of it, the other problem is that it's difficult for people in that role to start to think about these national issues in a coherent way. I think that one of the big challenges for us in Canada, you start with BC, having its usual tantrums that we're not in there, we're the last on the TV every election, all that kind of stuff. I think British Columbia kind of knows that it's a big deal. It doesn't feel that that's reflected in the treatment that it gets from Ottawa, even when we're friendly. I think Horgan's experience, whether people would say he was petulant, maybe, and didn't and should have been more accommodating. He felt he was extremely accommodating and didn't have much to show for it on a couple of occasions. And he said that. I'm not speaking secrets here. Was there more that could have been done? I think there could have been in certain respects, and it would have helped. So Jagmeet's got a problem because he has that problem in spades. Like, what does he say to these people? How does he become relevant? And so he's here from BC, but I think that there's a lot of internal debate needs to occur in the NDP, because unlike some of the other parties, we have that very strong federal provincial connection, and the decisions being made provincially are very hard to square with what some of the federal activists would like to say and do.
Right. Interesting. Okay, just quickly before we have to leave, Geoff, you mentioned the Green Party earlier, and I don't know whether we need to talk about the federal Green Party because it's dissolved into such a soap opera. But provincially, obviously, it was highly important, growing in strength, helped Horgan form his first government, then kind of got screwed by him, as third parties always do in the arrangement. Where are they at now?
That's not fair. Well, it's a good question where they are now, but they're not, in my view, making a big impact. Maybe Mike sees it differently. But I think that after Andrew Weaver left the stage, and for all of Andrew Weaver's issues, he was the leader when the agreement was formed with the NDP. He was a big personality in provincial politics, and he couldn't work out his internal relationships in the Green Party. So I think it's basically nowhere. It's a ghost that haunts political conversations on the center left in BC. But I put it on the table not because I think that it should need a lot of conversation, but just to point out it does not need a lot of conversation. Even in the civic scene, the Green Party hasn't grown. So for federal Liberals or for New Democrats, the risk on that side is not so great. And as Mike points out, the future of the NDP is in soft BC Liberal, who may be more conservative voters depending what day it is. That's where the fight will continue with the people on the other side of the house, is in those growing urban ridings in BC, which is a huge shift away from the resource communities. I mean, we had 300 layoffs, a very serious situation in Prince George yesterday, but or a couple of days ago at a pulp mill. Would have been an earthquake 10 years ago, and now everybody goes, well, how many did Amazon hire? So that the discussion in BC is shifting sharply, and that's having a big impact on politics, but it's not reflected necessarily in the way you would expect.
Well, just on the Greens, David, I think they're a third party. Their numbers are probably consistent. 12%, 15% of the vote. They've got 2 seats. They almost won a seat in Lower Mainland in the last election.
15's a real number, though.
Yeah.
When I was a provincial Liberal in Saskatchewan, I sure would have called that a real number.
They're like the Manitoba Liberals, or some of those third parties, right? They're hanging around. They've got a little foothold. They almost won a seat in West Vancouver, Sea to Sky in the last election. They probably could win Sunshine Coast someday with the right candidate. So they can make some incremental gains if they keep working at it. And then maybe one day they get lucky because a pox in all your houses, and people are looking for a protest vote. But right now they're ways away.
But they are sufficient to act as a check against a significant policy move away from climate change action?
They are for the NDP, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Listen, that's an hour that's flown by. You guys are fantastic. What a great team. I would love to have you back to talk about this some more, because, it's really quite difficult to follow BC politics from Toronto. You got to certainly log on to the Rosedeer.blog. But it's great to have you on and talking about it in such a thoughtful way. So we'll check back in, and I really appreciate this.
All right. Thanks for having us, David.
Thanks, David.
Thanks to our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail. Everybody who watched or listened, now you know a shitload about BC. Go and tell your neighbors. And we'll be back next week with more of the Herle Burly. Till then, take care of yourselves.
Herle Burly.